Chapter 4. Skills and Habits to Teach Yourself Anything. Sometimes you know that there's a gap in your knowledge, and that there's a question you have to ask that will clarify the information for you, but for whatever reason, you don't ask the question. Of course, that's in best-case scenarios when you even realize that something is askew. For me, this usually happened in math class in elementary school. Back in first grade, or so I was told, I made a fairly common mistake when it came to using rulers. The teacher asked us to use our rulers to draw lines of 2, 4, and 6 inches long. So I took out my ruler, put the pencil on the one spot, and drew a line to the numbers 2, 4, and 6. When I saw what I'd drawn, something seemed off compared to what my classmates had drawn. But I figured I'd done what I was asked and turned the paper in without asking the teacher about it. The truth was, I was in a rush to get out to recess and make sure my spot in the handball line was secured. But as an adult, you probably spotted my error. I started at 1 because that was the number I always started counting at. But I should have started at 0. I knew something was off, but didn't seek to clarify the instructions. I got all 3 answers wrong. After I returned from recess, my day was ruined. Other children laughed at me, and I ate my lunch grumpily and in silence. Of course, there's a difference between a first grader who's still trying to learn how to learn and an adult who's had plenty of experience in learning. But this shameful example from my past demonstrates one of the many habits and skills associated with self-learning: asking questions. It's not as simple as asking for facts, and it is indeed something that must be cultivated like any other skill. But when we take on the task of self-education, it's almost like having to adjust to a new way of learning. We have to tinker with our learning strategy as we shift from someone else teaching us to driving the teaching ourselves. This chapter covers some of the adjustments an aspiring self-learner can make to ensure that they get the most out of their studies. First up, we'll talk about how to create plans for learning. Plans, schedules, and goals. One historical figure who provides a fantastic example of how to create goals and plan yourself to success is none other than Benjamin Franklin. He's still the supreme example of an autodidact, a statesman, inventor, philosopher, writer, and polymath, whose curiosity knew no limits. Franklin was fastidious about keeping track of his goals, activities, and schedules, and he used them to navigate his personal and professional life. 2 of his daily techniques for arranging his life are perfect for those looking to improve their organizational skills for better learning. Both were laid out in detail in Franklin's autobiography, perhaps with the hope of inspiring future generations to similar levels of achievement and productivity. The first and probably more famous of Franklin's forms is his 13 Virtues checklist, which he used to chart his efforts in bettering himself as a human being. Although he used the 13 virtues for self-improvement, or, as Franklin put it, attaining moral perfection, they serve as a strong example of how to mindfully track progress and keep records of anything you want to develop, including self-learning. First, Franklin devised a list of 13 qualities he felt he needed to develop in order to live a healthy and conscientious life when he was 20 years old, a freakishly young age to display such maturity, if you ask me. They include merits, not relevant to this chapter's discussion, but helpful for illustration. Number 1, temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Number 2, silence. Speak not, but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Number 3, order. Let all things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Number 4, resolution. Resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail what you resolve. Number 5, frugality. Make no expense, but to do good to others or yourself. For example, waste nothing. Number 6, industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. Number 7, sincerity. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. Number 8, justice. Wrong no one by doing injuries, or omitting benefits that are your duty. Number 9, moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Number 10, cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanness in body, clothes, or habitation. Number 11, tranquility. Be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents, common or unavoidable. Number 12, chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring. Never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. Number 13, humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. Then he devised a system by which he strove to improve each area in a very deliberate, methodical way. Coming up with the idea for the list itself is revolutionary in a way, since it focused his attention on what he was trying to accomplish. It was also a tall task. How many goals are you currently working on right now? Is it anywhere close to 13? It's time to rethink what is possible. Franklin drew up a series of cards, each of which contained a very simple table with 7 columns and 13 rows. Heading each column were the 7 days of the week, Sunday through Saturday. At the head of each row were symbols for each of his 13 virtues. At the top of the entire page, Franklin wrote down the virtue that he chose to pay particular attention to for the duration of the week. The first week he chose to focus primarily on temperance. At the end of each day of the week, Franklin took out his card, reviewed the matrix, and put a black dot in each square for every instance during the day that he felt he fell short of maintaining that virtue. For example, if he felt he'd had too many glasses of wine at a Thursday dinner, he'd put a black dot in the temperance box for Thursday. If he decided he'd gotten a little too ticked off at George Washington at a Saturday meeting, he might put a black dot in the Saturday tranquility box. In any given week, Franklin primarily focused on the virtue he entered at the top of each card. His reasoning was that cultivating one virtue at a time would make next week's virtue a little easier to handle, and that each virtue would become a habit in time. Each virtue was carefully scheduled so that one week's virtue would help inform the next week's. For example, he put frugality the week before industry, because he thought the habit of saving money would inform his habit of working harder to obtain money. One at a time ensured that he wouldn't be overwhelmed and could discover what it took him to change a singular aspect of his life. After Franklin had worked his way through 13 weeks of checklists, he'd start over and begin a new series with his top virtue. He repeated all of his virtue exercises as he needed. If he faithfully did it every week, that meant he'd perform the task 4 times a year. 13 weeks times 4 equals 52 weeks equals 1 year. Really, you just have to stand back and admire how neatly Franklin worked a calendar. The genius of Franklin's checklist is that this approach works for other things besides becoming a better human being, though that's certainly a fine pursuit to try. Intentional planning, honest self-monitoring, and devotion of time without distraction is the name of the game. For many of us still, this is a level of attention and self-awareness that is unheard of. We tend to think of our behavior as inborn and relatively unchangeable, but that's not the case if you don't want it to be the case, like Franklin. This type of intentional development and improvement underlay his success and accomplishments. You can also use it to track progress and chart your tasks in anything, including individual subjects of self-learning. For example, if you're teaching yourself about the Spanish language and culture, you might come up with a few planks of your studies that you want to make sure you cover as much as possible. Reading, writing, audio practice, social studies, music, art, and so on. It might not make sense to cover each of these areas every single day, or maybe it would. But at least a certain number of times each week would be helpful. Instead of focusing on a virtue of the week, as Franklin did, maybe you'd pick a certain aspect of Spanish studies to focus on. Food, history, politics, sports, art, manners, whatever you know you'll be covering and could organize in a weekly cadence. The key to this system's success is knowing what aspects of your studies are most important to maintain. The same way Franklin decided what virtues were most essential for him to build on. Each subject will have different areas of importance. Separate them out and organize a plan of attack toward them that ensures that all your bases are covered. Your brain can only handle so many things at once, so plan yourself out of overwhelm and multitasking. Progress and learning in any regard require a steady march, even one that is tracked by weeks and years, as Franklin's 13 virtues were. Don't just do what you feel like or whatever pops into your mind. Be methodical and make sure nothing slips through the cracks. This is the purpose of the syllabus and schedule for a class in traditional education. Be sure to create your own to keep yourself on track and be an effective self-learner. As Franklin himself noted, the real value of this system is to instill better habits on a rolling, gradual basis. Any kind of study system is extremely dependent on how well you nurture positive habits. And this is exceptionally true with self-learning since you're in charge of monitoring everything. But we're not done with Benjamin Franklin yet, the famed proponent of the turkey as the national bird of the United States. How did he manage to accomplish so many great things in an almost countless number of areas? The second part of his planning genius stems from the daily schedule he kept for himself. In his biography, Franklin also took the time to map out his schedule for each day, from waking up to bedtime. For example, one of his typical schedules, partially paraphrased, looked like this: 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. Rise, wash, address powerful goodness, pray or meditate, schedule the day, prosecute the present day, study and research whatever projects he was pursuing besides work, eat breakfast. 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., work. 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., read, overlook my accounts, attend to his personal or financial business, eat lunch. 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., work. 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., reflect, eat supper, consider what good he'd done during the day, enjoy diversion like hobbies, music, or conversation. 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., sleep. This may not look like an especially precise schedule in comparison to the schedules we may keep today, considering the infinite number of appointments and meetings we tend to fill our calendars with, but it's a great example to follow because it allows room for everything necessary to one's mental well-being. It treats personal and recreational activities with the exact same importance as business and work. Everything he did was directed. It had its proper time and context, and all his activities were vital to his development, the same way his virtues were. In an ideal world, a schedule focused on self-learning wouldn't look too different. Franklin also differentiated between work he had to focus on exclusively, in those bigger morning and afternoon chunks, and work he could do while he was doing something else, like overlooking his accounts and conducting his personal studies. That undoubtedly gave him some flexibility and ease when he could take care of affairs that were important but could be done at a less active pace, among other relaxing things he did, like lunching. Actually scheduling time for personal reflection, something most of us probably don't think to do, shows that he realized it was both a vital activity to pursue and that it had its place during the day, no more or less important than anything else on his docket. Even with his somewhat slower pace of life, compared to our own, that is, Franklin didn't always strictly keep to his schedule. That's fine. I'm sure in his day, like our own, things just came up. The benefit of having that daily plan was that it made him happier to at least try to live according to a schedule. If he didn't even have an idea of what he wanted to accomplish on a certain day, he'd be lost. Having a schedule helped him feel more organized and productive, even if he didn't follow it 100% every single day. Simply having something to refer to with pre-made decisions can lend guidance and structure to a day that wouldn't exist otherwise. You see, it's when we are faced with decisions that we run into problems. Once you remove the presence of decisions with a detailed schedule, you are far more likely to go along with what needs to happen. So using Franklin's overall concept for your own schedule, here are some guidelines you should follow. Give yourself a couple of daily blocks to focus on your primary work, but give yourself as much flexibility within those blocks to mentally wander. Large blocks of time are more forgiving and allow you the space to go where the wind takes you. Schedule some time for recreation, leisure, personal reflection, or socializing with family and friends. Franklin knew these aspects were crucial enough to make room for them, especially personal reflection and understanding what went well and what needed to change during the day. The brain can't run on full speed all the time. Treat your personal goals with the same respect as your professional goals. In other words, schedule your self-learning with the same priority as your other responsibilities. Spend a relatively equal amount of time planning, ruminating, analyzing, and preparing as you do actually taking action. What went well and what didn't? Make sure you're doing the right thing instead of the easy thing, and that you learn from your mistakes and inefficiencies. Wash. Definitely find time to wash. These two habits of Benjamin Franklin, creating overarching goals and plans and adhering to a daily schedule, are habits we can emulate. Self-learning isn't something you can wing. Planning is paramount to self-learning because it is inherently tedious and boring, and sometimes you just can't give yourself the choice to not. Take a cue from this famous founding father and protect yourself from your worst impulses. The structures of long-range planning and schedules make it easier for us to achieve our goals. This brings us to the next question. What were those goals again? Attempting to set goals like Benjamin Franklin's 13 virtues probably won't work for us, for numerous and varied reasons. So, how can we use goals to plan ourselves into better self-learning? The first guideline is to accept that you don't really know what you don't know yet, and you're not going to find out until you finally know it. In self-learning, frankly in any ambitious goal, you'll often be coming face to face with the unknown. It's uncomfortable at best. You need to understand that and not let it scare you off from making the goal, because that's exactly what it does to a lot of us. Your goal is to learn things you don't know anyway. It will inevitably feel like a challenge, but you should make sure it's just the right amount of challenge for the right moment. You should try to establish goals that are realistically achievable and not so easy that achieving them won't make you feel a sense of accomplishment. They shouldn't be outrageously pie-in-the-sky goals that would be impossible in the short term, but they should be something you haven't done before. Maybe just a tiny bit higher than you think you can do, but not so high as to discourage you. There's a sweet spot as to how the goals you set can keep you motivated. For instance, if we apply this to Benjamin Franklin, we can say that he probably felt that attempting to master 20 virtues at once was too difficult, and decided an attainable challenge would be 13 virtues. Yet he felt that attempting to master 9 virtues would be settling. Everyone has different levels of what challenges them, and it's up to us to set goals that keep us moving toward them. Of course, for our purposes, these goals should be related to self-learning. If you want to learn French, utilize a goal that will enforce self-learning, such as having a casual conversation at a cafe. Learn 120 words if you imagine you can only learn 100, when in reality you are undervaluing your own skills. If you want to learn the violin, set a goal in learning a piece by your favorite composer, even if it's above your skill level. Learn the piece in 2 weeks and create a self-fulfilling prophecy by way of the goal you set. One handy mnemonic device that can help guide your goal setting is the SMART acronym. When you come up with a goal for learning, evaluate it to ensure how it meets 5 standards. That your goal is the following: specific, clear, and definitive; measurable, easy for you to track progress; achievable, within your reach, but not too simple; relevant, personally significant to you and your life; time-based, organized to some kind of schedule. For example, let's say you're planning on teaching yourself piano. If somebody asked you about it, you could say something like, "I'm going to teach myself everything about piano. By the end of this year, I'm going to be a virtuoso with amazing piano skills who can play anything and everything by ear." That would be a tad on the unrealistic side. Instead, use the SMART filters. Make your goal clearer and attainable. Specific: I'm going to learn music theory for piano and get to the point where I can understand and play basic sheet music. Measurable: I'm going to learn how to play 10 pieces on piano. Achievable: They're going to be somewhat uncomplicated pieces, not overly complex classical pieces, but something I think I can manage before I decide to take the next step. Relevant. I'm doing this because I'm a fan of music, and I really want to transfer my passion into making art. Time-based. I'm giving myself a year from now, practicing and learning at least 10 hours a week. Using the SMART guidelines to craft your goals will help you think about them more sensibly and practically. If you can center your planning on self-education goals that you can obtain with the resources you currently have, it will give you a better point of view and structure for the course you're learning and the courses you'll take in the future. Asking questions and pulling information. With your scheduling, planning, and goal-setting methods in place, you're ready to build the framework of what you're going to learn. The rubber is about ready to hit the road as you start cataloging your resources for your selected subject. And this is exactly the point where you can start getting overwhelmed in your self-learning strategy. These days, information is extremely easy to find and accumulate. Every subject under the sun is well represented by online resources and public libraries, and information is going to come to you, both through your self-guided efforts and from out of the blue. But all this information isn't going to teach you by itself. All it will do is present itself. The data you get doesn't necessarily explain its significance, its context, or meaning. When you're teaching yourself, you won't have a mentor always in place to explain the implications or value or what you're learning, because the structure is all up to you. So you'll have to be proactive about figuring out what all this new data means to your course of study. You'll have to do the investigative work to understand the framework and substance of all these bits of knowledge. We call this pulling information, because it means dragging what's important and creating significance out of the huge mass of info that's just been plopped down in front on you. Questions are the tools that you'll use to decipher and analyze all this information. But not all questions are created equal. You need questions to develop open avenues of perception and full comprehension of your subject, not just the surface details or dry facts. The questions you'll ask will penetrate far beyond simple common knowledge and will fill in the complete picture of what you're studying. This is commonly known as critical thinking, and it's the act of delaying gratification in lieu of accuracy and a three-dimensional understanding of the nuances presented to you. It's not terribly popular as a way of navigating life, but it's how you are going to learn to pull information out of your sources. The goal of critical thinking isn't to produce a quick, easy, digestible answer. In fact, it's not even to provide any certifiable conclusion whatsoever. Instead, the point of critical thinking is to increase your mental engagement with a certain topic. Rather than provide a rock-solid, inarguable conviction, critical thinking merely expands your viewpoint and gives you several ways to look at a situation or problem. It gets you past the external noise and easy answers to show you the whole scope of a circumstance or issue. No course of self-learning can succeed without critical thinking. The questions you use in critical thinking go beyond standard "just the facts, ma'am" inquiries. Instead, they challenge the answer to probe the reasons for a subject's importance, its origins, relevance, and countering or alternative beliefs. They can be applied to any subject, even with some adaptation, scientific, or mathematical principles. The goal isn't to get you to agree or disagree with a given doctrine, but just to understand the totality of its meaning. Let's try an example. Keynesian economics. All that you need to know about it is that it endorses the theory that increased government spending and decreased taxes are how economies can rally themselves out of depression and stimulate growth. It's tricky to discuss it without ruffling some political feathers, but that's a good reason to use it as an example of how to objectively question a topic. Here are some questions you could use to critically evaluate the topic. I'm not going to attempt to answer them because last time I checked, I wasn't an economist. But I did look up enough to form some decent questions, and the main point of this exercise is to show how they can be phrased. What makes Keynesian economics important? This question obviously seeks out why Keynesian economics are a thing and deserve to be talked about. Which details of Keynesian economics are important and why? This question gets down into the specific elements of Keynesian theory and how they affect certain specific factors of an economy. What are the differences between Keynesian economics and classical economics? This sets up a comparison of two different models or problem-solving methods and allows you to understand what sets one model apart from the other. How is Keynesian economics related to fiscal government policy? This question sets up a description of how the subject relates to other forces. What evidence can you provide for or against Keynesian economics? This question forces both positive and negative aspects of the subject. Each subject or topic has weaknesses and strengths regarding its applicability and universality. What patterns did you notice in Keynesian economics? This helps you seek repetitive elements and cause and effect relationships, which almost always indicate importance. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Keynesian economics? This question sets up another comparison between the possible effects of Keynesian economics. When might Keynesian economics be most useful, and why? This question seeks an example of how the concept is used in the real world and can affect your life. What criteria would you use to assess whether Keynesian economics are successful? This question seeks how to establish hard proof that a concept is working or not, and introduces the concept of specific metrics. What information would you need to make a decision about Keynesian economics? This question addresses the conditions in which Keynesian models can thrive, and generally what contextual information is important. What might happen if you combined Keynesian economics and supply-side economics? This question poses how the concept would flourish or fail when combined with aspects of an alternative model. What ideas could you add to Keynesian economics, and how would these ideas change it? This question challenges you to come up with your own educated ideas and project how they would change the concept. Do you agree that Keynesian economics work? Why or why not? This question encourages you to use your own reasoning to judge the merit of a certain concept. What solutions could you suggest to the problem of Keynesian economics? Which might be the most effective and why? Similarly, this question calls upon you to reason what could potentially improve the theory. How could you create or design a new model of Keynesian economics? Explain your thinking. This question encourages you to reimagine the concept in accordance with your own ideas and project how they could work in the future. Whew! That's a lot of questions. It's only a fraction of the many sides and angles from which you can examine any given issue. None of them are answered in definitive terms, nor can they be. But their open-ended nature encourages you to pursue the facts from an objective standpoint. Is this beginning to sound circular and repetitive? It can indeed be a never-ending and tedious exercise. But if you keep the purpose of discovery and perspective at the forefront, it seems more meaningful. At this point, you may have used all your questions to formulate a theory or conclusion, or you've come across conclusions from others that address their interpretation of what the facts mean. But as with the questions you've just asked, the conclusions you come across, even your own, should also be subjected to the same kind of inquisition as to whether the conclusions are sound and hold up. The first few questions should address the structure of the conclusion, whether it comes from a sound basis in reasoning. A second set of questions addresses instead the quality of the conclusions and supporting arguments. We can see this through the same example of our Keynesian economics model. What are the issues and conclusions of Keynesian economics? This question addresses the foundation of the theory, the problem it was trying to solve, and what the answers are. What are the reasons for your conclusions? A well-worded conclusion will list out the facts being used to support it. This question identifies what those facts are, and you better separate facts from anecdotes or feelings. What assumptions are you using in your theory? If there are any variable factors being used when the conclusion is formed, it's important to ferret them out. For example, the Keynesian model specifically addresses economic depression, so an assumption might be assuming the economy has declined by 85% over the preceding year. The next two questions seek to expose the shortcomings of thought that may have compromised the findings of the conclusions. Are there fallacies in the reasoning? This question seeks out any inaccuracies, mistakes, or outright falsehoods in any of the reasons given. For example, the original conclusion could have been based on incorrect economic data from the 1930s. It's a different way of playing devil's advocate and trying to understand opposing stances or conclusions. How good is the evidence? This is how you check that the supporting facts behind the conclusion are airtight, from legitimate sources, and not disclosed by bias or misinformation. Did they use statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor or someone's propagandistic personal blog? There's a chance that these questions might raise even more questions instead of answering all your inquiries. But again, that's the main point of this line of interrogation: to create a three-dimensional view of the topic you're investigating, and not just stop at the first answer that looks certain. Being certain is not the same as being right. In self-learning, you need to tune out the forced arguments born from someone who just wants them to be true, and focus on the real evidence and facts. Facts, in fact, are not enough for effective learning. Researching from scratch. The first step in learning anything is research, the step-by-step process of reading and analyzing materials relevant to your chosen field of interest. This is especially true when it is self-guided. But before we can understand and synthesize, we must find what we will be studying. It's a process that isn't inherently difficult, but many minefields exist that can derail your learning. There is no shortage of information about almost everything, and we have better access to data and facts than we ever have before. But the sheer amount of information we have can make us forget about how to research effectively. How can we steer clear of questionable sources and make sure our research will bear fruit? Research is a gradual process. It's methodical and investigative. These 5 steps of research, if executed thoughtfully and correctly, will give you what you need to gain mental command over a new topic. It's important to hit all 5 steps without skipping any. You'll be able to understand a concept, issue, or problem from a variety of angles and approaches. We'll go through an example after describing these steps to illustrate just what each step entails. Number 1. Gather information. The first step is to retrieve as much data about a topic as you possibly can. Collect anything and everything from as wide a range of sources as you can manage. At this early stage of research, don't be too discriminating. Get as much as you can from wherever you can find it. Think what it would be like if you searched on Google about a certain topic, got 10 pages or more of results, and clicked on every single link. The point isn't to get immediate answers. It's to get an initial panoramic overview of the subject you're investigating. So don't be too restrictive. Open the floodgates. Organize the information you gather into general topics, arguments, and opinions. You might find that you are more confused after this stage than when you started. That's fine and natural. What's important is that you have everything in front of you, from shallow to deep, and from correct to dubious. Number 2, filter your sources. Now that you've got all the information you need, it's time to identify what your sources are, what kind of information they present, and whether it's good or not. This step could reduce the amount of information you'll study by 75% or even more. Every information outlet has a different intent and approach over the subject matter it discusses. Some concentrate on hard and straight data. Some offer narrative accounts or anecdotes relating to the subject, while others offer editorial opinions or theories. Some sources are official agencies or authorities in your chosen field, while others are trade papers, media, groups, or associations who are interested in it. Some are simply blogs of opinionated people who have taken an interest in a particular topic with no expertise or common sense. And yes, some are fake news. Your goal here is to draw out the good sources and disregard the bad ones. A good source backs up its arguments and ideas with solid data, confirmable truth, and careful examination. A bad source is generally more interested in persuading through emotions and hyperbole, and might rely on misleading or utterly wrong data to do so. Don't confuse anecdote with evidence, even if there are multiple anecdotes. After all, that's how every single old wives' tale was started. At this stage, you'll start noticing some divisions in the research you've collected. You'll see certain sources' tendencies and inclinations. You'll get a sense of which are the most popular or common outlooks, the majority, which are the rarer or more unusual viewpoints, the minority, and which ones are straight-up crazy ramblings from the minds of lunatics, the crackpots. You'll be able to divide up the sources and retain the ones that are most reliable and helpful. Number 3, look for patterns and overlap. As you're viewing and reviewing all your source material, you'll begin to notice reoccurring topics, stances, and ideas. Certain points will crop up more frequently, and some will appear only once, seemingly randomly. You'll start getting a better idea of the primary points, secondary points, and boundaries of the subject you're looking into. You'll also be able to build bridges between parallel ideas and points of overlap. Here, you'll be able to identify the major components of your topic and the most prevalent thoughts and beliefs. Generally, the best sources will talk about the same things, so when that happens, you can safely assume they're the most important parts of your subject. When you see a point repeated by multiple sources, it's a good sign that you should consider it a major point or theme. Likewise, if you see things rarely mentioned by notable people in the field, or that don't fit into the prevalent views, you know it's probably not something that moves the needle, or is too new to be considered valuable. This isn't to say less common or alternative points of view are necessarily wrong. They aren't. But use your better judgment. If only one isolated source is making a certain assertion, even if they have disciples who agree with all they say, there's a much higher chance that they're discussing something that's not really true, or at least not very important. You should understand what the main points and arguments are and why, as well as a few of the minor ones by the end of this step. Getting through this stage alone may qualify you as an expert relative to others, and it's common that most people stop their journey in education here. But if you stop here, you risk falling prey to confirmation bias and not knowing what you don't know. Number 4, seek dissenting opinions. By this point, you'll no doubt have a theory or opinion in mind. You'll also have whittled down your sources to support that. So now's the time to look for sources that disagree with you. This is a hugely important step. Without knowing the full extent of opposing arguments, you won't have the complete picture that you need to understand the issue. No matter how convinced you are, try to find one. Don't be afraid to question your own viewpoints by playing devil's advocate. If there's a minor quibble you have about your theory, this is the point where you indulge your imagination. Imagine all possible scenarios and circumstances where your theory might be put to the test. Finding dissenting opinions is an important step in avoiding the all-too-common plague of confirmation bias, our human tendency to hear and see only what we want to hear and see. This is when someone dearly wants for a certain thing to be true, so they reject any solid evidence that it's false, and only accept information that confirms their beliefs. That leads them to cherry-pick data that supports their point and ignore hard proof that disproves it. Confirmation bias is not objective, so it has no place in actual research. To combat it, give the voice of the opposition clear and full attention. At this point, you may arrive at a conclusion that's been put through the paces. You have sophistication and nuance. The point is legitimate and not clouded by fallacies, misunderstanding, or disinformation. You'll comprehend your own beliefs more fully and understand why others may have different ideas. You'll be able to articulate precisely why you believe what you believe. Number 5. Put it all together. This is the point where you make your statement. Only after you've considered all the above, rather than shooting first and asking questions later. This is a point of clarity for you. You can explain all aspects of the topic or issue you're talking about. Write, speak, outline, or mind map confidently about your new area of knowledge. Here's an easy way to think about how to summarize your expertise. Put everything together to show how you understand the whole situation, including the small and nuanced points. X, Y, and Z because, however, A, B, and C because. If you can't do this with certainty, you may need to go back a step or two in the process. Let's show an example that illustrates all these steps at work, and with at least a clear path for anyone who wishes to be an expert on a certain topic. For the sake of description, let's say you have a deep and driving need to become an expert in the protest movements of the 1960s. Gather your info. Accumulate all the information you can without discrimination. History books, news articles, biographies, blogs, History Channel videos, websites, congressional minutes, newsreels, anything. You're just herding in all the info you can at this stage. Any information is good at this point. Use all mediums at your disposal. Don't forget to start your organization immediately by grouping and categorizing thoughts and opinions. Filter your sources. Do you have news clippings from established sources like the New York Times or Time Magazine? Are the stories verifiable? Do your biographies and nonfiction books provide meaningful information that's backed up, or are they thought pieces that don't rely on much data at all? Are the blogs you're looking at dependently referenced, or are they sloppily put together and filled with hyperbole? Are you actually just watching drunk history? This point is where you use your discrimination and decide what sources are worth listening to, even if they have rare arguments, and what sources you should ditch, even if they parrot popular stances. Sorry to say it, but some opinions are worth more than others. Look for patterns. Examine your sources for repeated mentions or descriptions of similar events. Say the Civil Rights Act, the assassination of JFK, the 1968 Democratic Convention. Look for similar trends across varied areas. Economic status, unemployment rates, election results, specific gatherings or protests. The more often a certain event or trend appears in your review, the more likely it is to have been truly impactful on the subject. Examine all the views you can find, majority opinion, minority opinion, and even the crackpot ideas. Finding repeated patterns will give you a more three-dimensional view of the landscape. Seek dissenting opinions. Hopefully by now you've formed a working thesis. Now you put it to the test by finding well-reasoned opposing viewpoints. Ideally, some of your filtered reading material contains at least one counter-argument that has rationally constructed viewpoints. Alternately, doing a very careful Google search might produce some results. Weigh these dissenting opinions against your argument and consider where you may need to adjust certain parts of your contentions. Assume that everyone believes wholeheartedly that they are correct, and you will be more open to seeking people's stances instead of shutting them down. Dig into not only what that opinion is, but why it is held, and the assumptions it is based on. Insert whatever conspiracy theory you might have heard through the grapevine about prominent assassinations, and you'll get the idea. Why did those ideas exist, and who do they benefit? Put it all together. Whether you keep it private or publish it, summarize your discoveries and opinions and keep them closely available. Make sure you've accounted for as many viewpoints as you can from both supportive and opposing viewpoints. For example, you may feel that the protest movements of the 60s arose from a sincere desire for change, but may have come across some opinions that said they were inside jobs coordinated by the government. Leave room for the dissenting conclusions of others. They'll give your final result more body and legitimacy. Remember, X, Y, and Z because, however, A, B, and C because. The skill of self-discipline. When I was young, a peer named Damon was strong in high school mock court tournaments. These are competitions in which you pretend to be part of a legal team arguing various cases in front of a judge. And in those days, if you won 4 cases in a row, you won the district championship. Before he got into mock tournaments, Damon wasn't so interested in the law. He was more into basketball. But once he found out he was really good at it in high school, he decided he'd go to law school after he graduated college. At university, he'd always talk about his ambition to be a lawyer, arguing huge cases that would impact society with his trademark wit and cunning. Years later, I ran into Damon at a local cafe. I asked him about his law ambitions, and he turned a little sour. I gave up. I underestimated just how much work and competition there was going to be. I was really looking forward to it. But after a few months of law school, I got nervous at how much of my life it was going to consume, and how insurmountable all the work was. So I just backed out. Now my life is a lot calmer, but there's nothing going on. I'm wondering if I should have given it more of a chance. We've loaded you up with a bunch of tools in this chapter. Frameworks, goal-setting tips, scheduling suggestions, and ways to reorient your intellectual approach and make meaningful investigations into your subject matter. With all this information, at first glance you might get discouraged and think the whole process of self-education is, well, insurmountable. And you would be exactly right. You're taking on a subject with which you're at least partially unfamiliar, and going after it from scratch with no outside force to help guide you. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This won't be easy. You shouldn't underestimate just how much of a tough job this is going to be. But why else would you want to do it? There are going to be moments in this process when you're not going to know where to go next. This not knowing will make you feel uneasy and undirected. At times, you'll feel like a juggler running out of hands. You'll be saturated with information. You won't know exactly how to connect all the dots and make the pieces fit. There will be concepts that you won't be able to grasp immediately. You'll have several plates spinning in the air, and you won't know what's going to happen to them until they fall to the ground. You'll probably want to quit. If you don't, you'll at least ask yourself if all this uncertainty is really worth the trouble in the end. You might feel this way more than once. Then, at some point, probably when you least expect it, you'll hear that first clink in your head, and something will finally make sense to you. This is going to happen. But before it does, you're going to have to go through the beginning of the process. And with very few exceptions, beginnings kind of suck. You may start out with confidence and resolve and even get through a couple of points in the beginning with those feelings intact. Then sometime when you feel you're supposed to make a great leap forward, you'll run into a mental roadblock. You'll feel anxious and doubtful. When this does happen, just remember this. You didn't sign up for this to quit only part of the way through. You committed to the long term. You committed to the greater vision. You're thinking about zooming out and understanding that the present moment will always be a blip, whether positive or negative. That's why it's important to keep the long view in mind when you're going through troublesome moments in self-learning. Your moments of anxiety will pass. It's all temporary. Admittedly, we're not used to keeping the long view in our minds. We're more conditioned to deal with what's right in front of us, to take care of the most immediate items. In that view, fears and worries have unusual power. They're right there in the moment, and we feel them more acutely. Disappointment and disillusion happen in everyone's lives, especially when we're working to make ourselves better. Those active negative emotions are present and certain, and the future that we're trying to improve isn't certain at all. Keeping an eye on your long-term goals, though, will help you power through these negative emotions. When they hit, just acknowledge them, validate their reality, and call up the reasons why you're undertaking this endeavor for the long term. Then move ahead. Failure isn't to make you stop what you're doing. It's supposed to redirect you and encourage you to find a new way to go. The way that we prove ourselves is through rising to challenges that are always going to be presented to us. What long-term thinking teaches us is that all these individual moments of terror over the uncertain future are temporary. They're not going to last. By keeping focused on that goal line, no matter how far off it is, those anxious moments will lose their power over time. They'll all eventually feel like exactly what they really are: temporary setbacks and minor exercises you need to go through to get where you're going. One of two things will happen if you adopt the long game and acknowledge that the pain won't last. You'll either get used to the discomfort or the discomfort will dissipate. In either scenario, the anxiety will lose its power over you. In a similar vein, you need to build confusion endurance. This confusion may come as a result of not knowing where to start, being perplexed at how to attack a problem, having a muddied view of what you're trying to achieve, wondering what resources are available and relevant to the task, and the like. Confusion endurance is all about being able to stay with a task and persisting instead of abandoning it when things get too difficult. It's about being able to persevere when you have the uncertainty and confusion of juggling multiple balls and not knowing where they will all land. It's the feeling of coming to a fork in the road with 10 paths and having to analyze each path. Say you're standing in the middle of a messy room filled with boxes upon boxes of clutter to move and organize. It's an uncomfortable feeling to be surrounded by essentially chaos. You'll need to get creative with organizing the interior of the room in order to have enough space for everything you need to store inside it. If you don't have the ability to endure the chaos created by the mountain of disorganized stuff around you, you'll never stay with the task long enough to figure out a viable solution. You'll need sufficient confusion endurance to withstand the initial disarray you're faced with, as well as the personal bewilderment you may feel from not knowing where to start or how to get the task done. The bottom line is to remember that by taking on self-learning, you're doing something that is uniquely rewarding, that only some of us ever do. It will impact your life and your confidence in exponentially positive ways. It'll be hard, it'll be frustrating, and it'll be a while. But embrace the uncertainty and the challenge and keep the long view uppermost in mind. When you finally get to where you want to go, all these obstacles will look like anthills in retrospect, and you'll know you're the better for them. Takeaways. There are certain skills and habits you must cultivate in your quest for self-learning and self-education. Many of these stem from the simple fact that with no one else to regulate you, you must do it yourself. Again, the theme that you must be both student and teacher rears its ugly head. First, plans, schedules, and goals should all figure heavily into your self-learning. In fact, they should be one of the first things you create, all three of them. Take a page from Benjamin Franklin, twice, and implement a daily schedule that simplifies your decision-making, as well as a plan and schedule for accomplishing your goals. Make sure your goals are challenging enough to be motivating, but not so impossible as to create discouragement. Think smart. Information itself is not going to teach you. You must have a dialogue with the material you discover and interact with it in a way that makes up for not having a stimulating teacher or professor. You must pull information out. You can accomplish this through asking critical and probative questions. The goal is to gain understanding, context, and perspective, not to seek a correct answer. As long as you focus on the overall purpose of finding a nuanced and three-dimensional view of a topic, your questions will be well guided. Research. It's not as simple as going to the library and checking out a book or consulting Wikipedia and calling it a day. In the same vein as the previous point on pulling information, you must ensure that you are finding a complete and thorough understanding of a topic through 5 steps. Gather, filter, find patterns, seek dissent, and put it all together. Self-discipline is needed in heavy doses because self-learning is not an innately pleasurable pursuit. It's work, and it can induce anxiety, stress, and discouragement that ultimately lead to giving up. Look at your moments of anxiety and view them as temporary and passing. The pain won't last forever. You'll grow accustomed to it or you'll solve it. These are all acceptable outcomes to the occasionally painful process you must endure. This has been The Science of Self-Learning: How to Teach Yourself Anything, Learn More in Less Time, and Direct Your Own Education. Written by Peter Hollins. Narrated by Gregory Allen Siders. Copyright 2018 by Peter Hollins. Production copyright by Peter Hollins.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.